Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself, as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome to the podcast American Medieval. I am very pleased to be joined by my friend, Eleanor Janega. Eleanor is a podcaster, historian, TV personality, and just all-around amazing person. Thank you for joining us, Eleanor.
A pleasure, Matt. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's very exciting to be launching this podcast with you. And I've been thinking a little bit about kind of what I wanted to do on this podcast. And as I am trying to do a serious topic, but I am not a particularly serious person, which I think you will vouch for. I wanted to start off with maybe what might seem like a silly question, if that's okay.
Okay, I love it. Yeah, let's go.
Great, let's go. And it's about time machines, okay? Because I think that all historians, anybody who studies the past, like we have sort of complicated relationships, feelings towards time machines, you know? I shouldn't say relationships. There are no time machines that I am actually aware of right now, but feelings about time machines. And so I want you, if you play with me for a minute, is that imagine that we have a time machine and a time machine is presented to you in 2025, Eleanor, and you are going back into the past to talk to a young Eleanor, a childhood Eleanor Janega, and tell them that they will someday be a medievalist. How does young Eleanor react to that news?
That is a really good question. I think that she would actually be pretty hyped.
Okay.
On it.
Okay, good.
Especially, like, depending on what age we're at, I think for a while, I guess it would be a surprise to 0 people that I was a Tolkien nerd.
Okay.
Right. You know, which is,
Yeah.
there's a lot of it about in the medieval studies field.
Absolutely.
So I was incredibly into The Lord of the Rings, you know, down to like reading the Silmarillion in 5th grade because, you know, I'm cool.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I feel like I would have understood that angle and I would have got that. And I think when I was deep in the Tolkien fields, when I was a little thing, I kind of wanted to be an author.
Oh, okay.
As a grown-up, I realized that I have no capacity for fiction. I'm in awe of people who can do it. I don't really understand how to write plots and things like that.
Sure.
So I think that, you know, it would be close enough to something that little Eleanor thought was cool.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think she would be slightly baffled, you know.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Like how did we get to professional nerdery, like as opposed to artistic nerdery, I guess.
Yeah. No, there always seems to be, like, whenever I've, had this kind of vague conversation, kind of what got you interested in the Middle Ages, or even when I talk to my students or something like that, like there's some sort of kind of thread that everybody can kind of pull on, right? All the way back to childhood. Tolkien, as you said, like very common in the medievalist or the professional medievalist community. It could be tabletop gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, things like that. But it often does have that fantasy element, doesn't it? Like there seems to be kind of that close connection that draws people into the study of the actual past through that fantastic world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's no surprise, obviously, that Tolkien was a medievalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, C.S. Lewis as well, but, who's counting that? I'm afraid I fall down into the like snobby camp on these things. But, really high fantasy is predicated on medievalisms and on these understandings of what the medieval world sort of looked like, to the point that we're still doing this now, whether we're talking about House of the Dragon or things like that.
Yeah.
We still really have these particular medieval elements to fantasy. And I've always kind of fallen down on the fantasy side of like nerdy literature. Sci-fi is a bit less for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a monster. I like the culture novels, obviously, but like that's not really what gets my gears cranking, right? I am really like, I want a dragon.
Yeah.
I want there to be magic of some description. And I do think that obviously the study of medieval history, dragons few on the ground, but you do get to access a headspace in which there is a world where theoretically they could be around the shop. And so it's a way of doing that in a kind of grown-up manner, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it is kind of when the fantasy kind of pulls professional medievalists like into the field, or, not just professional medievalists, but anybody who's kind of interested in the actual period itself. A lot of it has to do with aesthetics or almost like vibes, right? Like it's not that like we know kind of consciously, I think we know, right? Most people that there weren't actually dragons in the Middle Ages. There wasn't actually magic, but there were castles and there were knights and there were those kinds of things. And that seems to be kind of a really strong connection, regardless of kind of what genre of thing you did as a child or as a young adult that kind of got you into that place.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot to that as well. I mean, I suppose even like going even further back when I was a tiny little thing, like preschool and kindergarten, I went to Waldorf schools.
Okay.
So, which is for those who don't know, it's kind of like a German hippie schooling thing. You're in the woods half the time, and the other half the time you're watercoloring and making gnomes out of felt and like learning to count using horse chestnuts and things of this nature, right? And there's a lot of medievalisms involved in that. Like there would be a big party every year for Michaelmas.
Okay.
And there was a lot of like learning about St. George and things like that. And so I was always kind of in a milieu where that was kind of like pro.
Okay.
And I think also, just that bedrock of kind of like, here's the way that you imagine things, I suppose. It was really in there. And then being able to kind of transpose that onto a worldview is interesting. And, I guess because I was raised by nerdy people, we had those books like they're called Castle or Cathedral.
Oh yeah, those kind of cross-section books, right?
Yes, yeah.
Was it David Macaulay, I think it was?
David Macaulay's ones. So we had both Castle and Cathedral. We also had Pyramid, which I also loved. But that was, very influential on me. And, a lot of Lego castles, very specifically, like that's
Legos. 1,000%.
Yeah, so we had like a lot of medievally things around. So I guess that for me, it was just sort of how one imagined, right? Like this was kind of like the bedrock of the way that you think about anything that is vaguely fun.
Sure.
It was just kind of like impressed upon me as the sphere in which you imagine, I guess. I never had a chance, Christ, when I think about it.
You really didn't. I mean,
I did not. No, yeah.
Like it is both the most kind of prototypical pathway to medievalism and also, if I can say, like the most Pacific Northwest thing that I've heard about.
So it's pathetic.
Counting horse chestnuts.
Yeah,
it's just,
really,
amazing. But it's also, I think, that brings up another kind of issue, which is that in most public schooling across the United States, at least, like the medieval world is not really part of the curriculum. Like it is kind of run through incredibly quickly. If there's any attention to it paid at all. I remember vaguely back to like 9th or 10th grade in my public high school in upstate New York, I think the teacher even said like, we're just not going to spend a lot of time on the Middle Ages because nothing happened then.
Oh, so, yeah, nothing that 1,000 years, I wouldn't worry about it, bro.
Yeah, that 1,000 years across 3 continents, at least 3 continents, right?
Yeah,
like nothing really to pay attention to.
It was pretty boring. Yeah.
It was pretty interesting. Yeah, and so, for me, like the things I actually learned about the actual period, and I wasn't a Tolkien person, but I was kind of all the Tolkien kind of 80s and 90s fantasy literature. So like Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms and all that kind of stuff. And I played a lot of D&D. So that was my path. But really it was in college that I had an actual like teacher who wanted to talk about the Middle Ages that got me particularly interested in as well. And it sometimes can be those personal connections too, that people, unfortunately, if they're not in those college spaces, really don't get the opportunity to experience, right?
Yeah. Oh, and that's what I always say, because, for me, I guess that I always had this background interest, right? But when I initially got to undergrad, I had been fully intending to do Chinese history because I was just really quite, again, Pacific Northwestern reasons, right?
Yep.
But I went to Loyola Chicago because I had done Catholic school. And there was the specific thing where they will give you a dump truck full of money to go to Jesuit university if you went to a Jesuit high school, which I did. So I was like, yeah, fantastic. I love money. So I go to Loyola Chicago, and I had done AP classes. So I had tested out of like the history 101 and 201. And they said, okay, well, here's the course catalog. It was still catalog at the time, which dates the
Yep.
story.
Yeah, an actual paper thing. Like,
Yeah,
you imagine that. Yeah.
Yeah, which was so delightful. I remember just loving it, which of course I did. Like, that's how you end up with a PhD, right? Is being like, oh, I could take any class I want. Christ.
Yeah.
But I ended up just kind of like flicking through it. And I think that the Chinese history prof was like on sabbatical that year or something. And I was like, oh, medieval history. Like, I've never really, because we touched on it in like AP European history.
Sure.
But it was just sort of like, hey, I don't know, Magna Carta. Anyway, here's Henry VIII was essentially like what happened.
Yep.
And I think we talked a little bit about the Black Death, and I was always interested in the Black Death. So I was like, okay, well, I'll do that. That'll be brilliant. And I was just pulled under, just like completely like, never mind, nobody who like Chinese history, who nobody cares. I just fell so in love with it. And I mean, I think that was also down to the quality of teaching we had at Loyola, because I was doing a lot of work with Barbara Rosenwein, Teresa Gross Diaz, Buckles was there. There was just this really, really amazing group of medievalists. And I think because I'd never really been offered it before, that was part of the allure, was that it was something that I genuinely felt I hadn't had access to previously.
So something new and different, really, right? Yeah. No, and I think that could be part of that attraction, right? Is that it is something that kind of is in the kind of cultural imaginary in the United States. But again, it's not offered. And so when it is offered, because Americans talk about the Middle Ages a lot, right?
Oh, God, yeah.
Like kind of all the time, and not just in a high fantasy way. Absolutely 1,000%, all the way, well, not most recently, but recently with Game of Thrones, and then all the way through all the stuff today. But even the period itself, I mean, there's references to the medieval can't throw a rock at the newspaper nowadays. Well, you won't hit a newspaper because newspapers don't exist. But, you can't throw a rock at Google News search without hitting the word medieval in some particular way. So, but like the thing that I'm struggling with, and I mean, the thing that I'm thinking about, like, as I'm kind of launching this podcast now is like, why? Like, what do Americans find interesting? Because there's this kind of, it seems to me, a dichotomy in that Americans don't think we have a Middle Ages. That is, of course, not true. There were lots of people populating North and South America during that period. They did lots of really fascinating things. There's archaeological evidence, there's lots of scholarship on that. We pretend that doesn't kind of exist in a lot of ways. That's a whole other separate
That's another,
podcast.
yeah, for sure.
But we feel an attachment to European history, like in that way, which makes sense, kind of the whiteness of colonization and the logic of that, and et cetera. But then we don't spend any time kind of thinking about it in public spaces. So it happens in this really piecemeal way. Like, does that make any sense?
Yeah, that does, actually, because I think the way that Americans relate to history is often quite confused, right?
Yeah.
Because certainly, I think that if you asked the average person, I guess that we see ourselves as part of like a big air quotes around the West, right?
Sure.
Like this is a part of the tradition that we're in. And certainly, we started as a European colony. And as a result of that, you have to hook yourself back into Europe in order to understand how we came to this position at all whatsoever. Now, I think that this kind of bifurcated approach to how we think about the Middle Ages is that, on the one hand, Americans think that you don't need to think about medieval history because, well, America didn't exist as the political polity that it is during that period of time. So therefore, it's unnecessary to know about it.
Sure.
But we're supposed to understand ourselves as part of this big European tradition that happened. And I mean, I tend to argue that the desire to ignore medieval history has rather a lot to do with how the American Empire came into being and what it was and what it meant, because it is very specifically like a big slaving empire, right? Like that's what it is. It's a slaving empire, and it is a quite violent one that violently subjugates almost an entire continent, and it does rather a lot of warring. And that kind of puts it more on the Rome side of things. So I think that there is this tendency to say, well, you don't need to know about the Middle Ages because there wasn't even a big slaving empire. So like, what are you going to learn about it? And I think that, there's no surprise that, for example, our federal buildings are all neoclassical.
Yep.
It's specifically going back to Rome. So you don't want to, when you are setting up a big slaving empire, to admit that there was this 1,000 years of complex, interesting history that is rooted in smaller polities that are more localized. You want to push the boat all the way out to other globe-striding colossuses, right? So I think that there's rather a lot of that in there. And, I think that that's also one of the issues that we face as medievalists if we're looking at any curricula, right, is that they are going to be set by a centralized government, and really kind of to an extent what's in it for Americans other than connecting us to that sort of European heritage. And I think that the more nefarious parts, for example, of right-wing ideas about history, sort of like medieval history as a secret. Right. So on the one hand, it's like pro-Rome. Yay, we love slaves. Woo woo. That's really good. And then also, if nobody knows about medieval history, you can turn it into anything you want to.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so if, nobody knows about the Crusades, you could act like Crusaders are romantic figures when they're just a bunch of losers. Right. Like, you can use the Middle Ages in all these really nefarious ways if people don't know about it.
Yeah.
So it kind of creates it as an esoteric knowledge that it can be used for ill, I guess. The Nazis did it as well. It's one of these things that really crops up a lot. Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I hadn't thought about it this way, but I mean, there are, if we think about kind of the stories that Americans tell about ourselves in our own kind of political history back to the kind of the founding 1776 and all that, these white guys who created this government were Enlightenment men. And so they bought the Enlightenment myth, right? That Rome was important, Greece was important, the Middle Ages were not important. And so that has been kind of submerged, but just kind of carried forward through time and just kind of reiterated so that there's an acknowledgement that that time exists, but at the same time, it just becomes this kind of dark age, for lack of a better term, right? So, well, actually, there's lots of better terms than that. But
yeah, but, like the idea of dark ages being a pejorative, like that's, a very useful idea to them, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it does a certain political work, right? And cultural work, not only to do that, to think about kind of ancient Greece and Rome, but to make sure that America is positioned. I think this is kind of what you're saying, right? Is that as uniquely modern, it is a modern nation. Like it has a history, but it doesn't rely on that history in order to justify its own existence in the way that European states in some ways kind of do, right? Like we are technology forward, ever expanding, looking forward, not back in that particular way.
I do think also, the fact that we were attempting to break from a monarchy, there's this sort of idea that, monarchies are a specific part of a medieval past. And so therefore, if you want to get away from a monarchy, you need to get away from medieval ideas.
And a centralized church related to
absolutely.
that. Well, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think that also, as I think largely Protestant country, there is also this knee-jerk reaction to the Middle Ages because, the Middle Ages is for Catholics. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Straight out of German Protestant Enlightenment historiography, right? So, I mean, French too, but
Well, yeah, quite so. I mean, and that's the thing is you get it from both sides because of Voltaire, right?
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah. One of medievalists' favorite figures, Voltaire.
Oh, this guy, I'll see him in hell. I'll tell you that much. So.
No, absolutely. So one of the things that I think that is kind of curious is that although we have this kind of shared experience as American medievalists doing this kind of work, various ways of kind of getting us interested in the period is that we end up obviously in very different places. So I want to take a moment. This is my awkward transition to ask you about kind of your own research and kind of your own interests. You initially became, like you worked on your dissertation on Czech history. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So what kind of got you interested in that particular area and that kind of particular period? And like, maybe just give us like a minute on like kind of what is Czech medieval history?
Oh, it's the best is the answer.
Well, that is the short answer, yes.
Yeah, obviously. So I come by it through family interests. So my family were, when they immigrated to America on my dad's side, we were Czechoslovakian, which was a thing that one could be at the time, and which we actually are. My grandfather is a Slovak. The last name Janega that's a whole other kettle of fish, but it's kind of like Silesian. And my grandmother was Czech. And so I always say that I kind of ended up feeling more Czech, although ironically I spent more time around my mother's family. My grandparents are Irish on that side. And so I was always around all of my Irish cousins and my Irish aunties. And what they would say to me all the time is, you don't look Irish, you look Czech.
Oh,
so
okay.
I was like constantly being like othered from that side of the family who were, they're all like Colleens. They're all dark hair, blue eyes, white skin. And, I was like a giant with blonde hair, and it was just sort of like, yeah, no, kind of a deal. So I think that I just sort of like felt rather Czech. And then when I got to university, I was around my dad's family because they were in Chicago still.
Okay.
And so that was something that I was quite interested in. And so I ended up living during university in the Czech Republic for quite some time. So at first I lived in Moravia, like out in the countryside, which is a great way to get your Czech good very quickly, because there was not an opportunity to really speak English. So I was like, here we go, we're doing it. And then I went to Charles University in Prague for a while. I was, by this point in time, quite interested very specifically in the 14th century, because I love it when things go wrong.
14th century is a good period to watch things fall apart, isn't it?
Yeah. But then weirdly, not in the Czech lands.
Sure.
For God knows whatever reason, right? And the 14th century is this time where Bohemia is really ascendant. Charles IV, who was then Holy Roman Emperor, he embarks on this huge building project all throughout Prague. He starts the university that I was at. He builds, the Charles Bridge. He rebuilds the castle. He builds all of these squares. Like every church that someone wants to take a picture in front of, Charles IV paid for that. And so I became rather interested in this building project and I desired to create a European capital in the 14th century and what that means. Like what does forward thinkingness look like in the 14th century? Everywhere else you go in Europe in the 14th century, it's like, oh, you go to Rome, we're having civil wars. England and France are at each other's throats. The Black Death is everywhere, but then like weirdly not. In Bohemia, they're like, yeah, no, we don't have that. They're like, what do you mean you don't have it? And they're like, no, not doing it.
Yeah, we decided to pass on that.
Yeah, we're just not doing that. It's funny because there's a debate about that. But the thing is, it just literally no one's writing about it. In the 14th century, nobody's like, yeah, plague came through here, we all died. But they write about it happening in other places. They're like, it's crazy down in Rome. You heard about that? That's wild. I could never be me, kind of a thing. And so they also have this perception of themselves as kind of like uniquely blessed by God at the time. And I find that so interesting. And also they're teetering on the precipice of starting the first Reformation that happens in Europe with the Hussites in the 15th century.
Jan Hus, yes.
That's my boy, though.
Yeah.
And so I was really interested in this particularly unique history. And by this time, I was pretty sure that I knew I wanted to do my PhD. And I said to myself, there is a lacuna in like the English language historiography surrounding Bohemia, despite the fact that it's one of the most important kingdoms in medieval Europe. And every medievalist can tell you that. They're like, oh yeah, Bohemia, very, very important.
Yeah. And
then I was like, oh, so we'll want someone to like look in on that and write a lot of books about it, won't we? And everyone's like, oh, honey, no. Like, by the time I finished my PhD, it turns out no one's interested in actually fixing that. They just are like, that's crazy. So like a lot of work goes on, obviously, in the Czech Republic and also within the German sphere. They write rather a lot about Bohemia because they understand. But unfortunately, the Anglosphere is a lot less interested in solving this. They just want to go to Prague on holiday. It's just, don't start me.
I mean, worth going to Prague on holiday, I would say. But at the same time, it is worth actually understanding those countries and their history as well. It's interesting too that, English-speaking scholarship specifically related to the Middle Ages, like it still tends towards national history of the British Isles predominantly. Like it's like a replication kind of 19th century kind of elite preoccupations. It's like, we're going to study ourselves, British Isles. France, well, I go down on holiday. Okay, that works. Germany, we have this kind of connection to. Fine, yeah, all right, whatever. And then Italy is just like, oh yeah, I did the Grand Tour, so like, yeah, you're gonna want to talk about Rome. But like any place else, like Iberia, Silesia, any place east, any place kind of in this squishy middle between kind of quote unquote France and Germany. Yeah, I don't know about that.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the case. It is interesting, right? And now that I'm like really as a medievalist, kind of like making my money from broadcasting. This is something that I still run up against, like even when I can, in theory, decide what it is I want to work on, I have to still sell my work to a broad audience. And it's a lot easier to just say to people, I don't know, what do you think about England? Right? And so I spend all this time doing all of this work on England. And granted, I also live here.
Yes.
But I'm not actually particularly interested in it. I mean, I think it's fine, but, it's medieval, so I like that. But would every day of the week rather talk about Iberia or Bohemia or, Sicily. I think that there are a lot more interesting places with a lot more interesting things going on, but I'm also aware that I need to be selling to people, right? And you can, I think, change tastes, and it's something that I'm attempting to do, and I won't stop talking about Czech stuff ever. Like, can't stop, won't stop kind of a thing. But, that is something that, I'm making a concerted effort to kind of nudge the needle on that and say, well, are you interested in this?
Yeah.
And actually, to be fair to most people, I do think that the average individual, if you give them access to things that they're not ordinarily offered, they love that.
Yeah.
They think that's brilliant. But it's just whether or not people are willing to take a chance on it. Like, if I'm pitching television shows, it's a lot easier for me to say, hey, do you want to do something about the Norman Conquest?
Yeah.
Than it is to say, hey, can we talk about 14th century Prague? And, I've got the desire to do that. But whether or not, the people with the money want to greenlight what it is I'm suggesting is another question altogether.
Well, but that runs into, as we were saying, and I think in academia, it's kind of a much smaller version of that too. But the economics of actually doing or working on the Middle Ages, right, is that there's an assumed demand for certain types of things by publishers, for example, both academic and trade or more popular. But then, of course, in broadcast as well, like you were saying, is that it is a safer bet to do something on the Norman Conquest because everybody kind of knows about it rather than, Jan Hus, who is a super fascinating, really interesting, complicated kind of figure that people might be really interested in hearing about, but it's not worth the risk, right? From an economic sense.
Exactly. And, this is why I am quite thankful to, for example, the video game world.
Yeah.
I think it has gone a long way to helping people like me who are interested in more theoretically esoteric subjects, because stuff like Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is set in Hussite Bohemia, has done wonders for my ability to talk to people about Czech history, because it's like, oh yeah, I know that from the video game, and you're like, okay, great, that's an in. And I think one of the biggest things we're sort of looking for as medieval historians is ins. It was great for us when Game of Thrones was out, for example, because you could be like, and that's a lot like Game of Thrones, and then people would say, oh well, because in theory it's kind of like based on the Wars of the Roses, and you can go with that. And
I taught for several years a shortened winter session course on Game of Thrones, in which all of my students, and it was generally pretty full for like 3 or 4 years while I was doing it, kind of right at the height of kind of Game of Thrones mania, and they would come in and they would want to be talking about kind of the lore of Westeros. And what they got was an intensive seminar on medieval gender, issues of medievalism, and issues of kind of political economy. So, which they kind of got because we'd watch an episode, and then they'd kind of respond to it, and then I'd pull out themes and have readings related to it and stuff like that. But I think that's something that medievalists really do rely on, right? Is those kind of pop culture ins. And I remember, like, in that Twitter discourse about Game of Thrones specifically, there was a lot of interest of medievalists in doing this kind of work, but there was also a lot of pushback, right? Because there was concern from a lot of scholars about kind of the lack of historical accuracy, which to me was not a particularly interesting question, because it's fiction, man.
Yeah, well, that's the side I fall down on, right? And you can go back and forth on this, right? Because I think that what I always say is that I find stuff like Braveheart to me is the worst that you can be, right? In terms of this, because what you're purporting to do is tell a historical story, and you're not. Like, you're just wiling out, actually. You're just like, I mean, I think it's literally the first screen of Braveheart has historical inaccuracies on it, and it's like the year is like blah blah blah. It's like, no, it's not. That's not the king. Like, none of this is real, And I think that is way more dangerous, because it's a big budget costume drama about like a named historical person, and then people think they're learning history. And I think you can compare and contrast that with Game of Thrones, where I'm like, baby, there are dragons. Like, I'm sorry, you do need to calm down eventually, because a lot of this plot hinges on magic, right? So I just fundamentally, I do believe that people are smart enough to deal with fiction. I really do believe that.
Sorry to interrupt myself, But I wanted to pause, take a moment, and remind everyone how this podcast will work. Every week on Wednesdays, we'll release a new episode to talk about the Middle Ages and how Americans have thought about the medieval past. And although these episodes are free to listen to, they're not free to make. So I'd be grateful if you'd head to patreon.com/AmericanMedieval to support us. You'll sleep the restful sleep of the saints for supporting a good history podcast, of course, but you'll also get some cool extras to learn more about what we're talking about in the episodes. Maybe more importantly, before we get back to the show, I want y'all to know that American Medieval is a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. Multitude is a podcast company made up of passionate people creating shows you can count on. The shows you'll find here are all smart, funny, and just plain interesting. But maybe the thing I love most about my sibling shows is that these, like American Medieval, are all hosted by experts with the intention of inviting people in. They don't, in other words, just pass along information. Instead, they invite all of us as listeners to be part of a knowledge creation together. That's the good stuff. You'll hear more about Multitude and the specifics of all these great shows during future episodes of American Medieval. But until then, if you do want to learn more, head to multitude.productions and check these shows out for yourself. Okay, now back to the Middle Ages. You're always going to get some really bad takes in which people do have a trouble, but that's true of novels too. I remember very distinctly, I am old enough to remember Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code when that was big, and that had a very strong kind of medieval subplot. I remember one of my family members, who will remain nameless for the purposes of this podcast and my relationship with Christmas coming up, but who came up to me and said, like, Matt, you're working on your PhD in medieval history. This book at the beginning says it contains facts. What are the facts here? And I had to look at him and said,
there is a guy named Leonardo da Vinci, and he did.
Yeah, there's a city named Paris, and there's a museum called the Louvre, and that's really mostly it. Yeah. So.
Okay, so I have been triggered by this because over the past couple of weeks, friends of mine decided to torture me by making me read the new Dan Brown book, which is called The Secret of Secrets, and it's set in Prague.
Yes. Is it really? I had no idea. Okay. All right. All right, here we go.
Yeah, it is. And it's really interesting, right? It's set now, obviously, but it's amazing because it's a Prague that is inhabited almost exclusively by Americans. And like the plot hinges on Americans entirely. There are 3 named Czech people, 2 of whom are bad guys, who are the 2 Czech men who are named are bad guys, and they're described as like a spider and like a thug, respectively.
Jesus.
And the named Czech woman is a 6-foot-tall ex-model who is, in love with one of the Americans. And they just talk about how hot she is the whole time. And I'm like, great.
Wow.
Really good. And it's like, there are whole parts of it that I swear to you read like advertorials. Like I firmly believe that you received money to write about this right now. And every single time a Czech landmark is mentioned, it reads as though it's out of Wikipedia. And this drives me nuts because I'm constantly trying to say all the time, Americans like Prague, let's talk about this. Can we talk about this? And it's like, you're not allowed to do the history, but you can write some xenophobic screed, about how the, Americans are being wrongfully persecuted in the Czech Republic. And I'm just like, my God, so.
There's one bit in the Da Vinci Code which I will remember to the end of my days because again, this came out in graduate school, and so we would all get together. The medieval historians would get together and kind of talk about it and make fun of it and stuff like that. But there's one time at which the professor at Harvard, who's the main character in the Da Vinci Code, meets with his publisher for this fancy dinner in New York City, which is what all academics do when they meet with their...
And publishers, they just give us so much money. And
they give you so much money. They take you, they wine you and dine you all the time. It's just the fanciest restaurants.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's all. In fact, I'm eating kind of Wagyu steak right now, thanks to my publisher. Yeah. Yeah.
There's rather a lot of that in this book as well. And also there are several infuriating things for medieval historians in it. So, there's It's the same Harvard professor who's world famous, and he's got a girlfriend who's another world famous professor. You know how it is.
Yep.
And she's giving like a big lecture about brain science.
He probably calls it brain science too, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's like, I think it's like noetics or something. It's just fucking ridiculous. But like in her like big keynote speech in Prague Castle, because absolutely, they let academics have speeches in there. Sure. She claims that until Magellan circumnavigates the world, everybody thinks the world is flat. So that was pretty cool. And then later on, there's like an entire plot point around the Codex Gigas. So like for those who don't know, the Codex Gigas
that
like
satanic codex. Yeah.
Huge Bible, thing.
Yep.
He's like, oh, I teach this at Harvard. And part of what he does is he's like, oh, the mystery about it. Because since it was only made by one scribe, it would take 40 years to write it. But in the Middle Ages, everyone dies at 32. So how could this Bible have been written? Riddle me this. And I'm just like, oh my God. Like, I just like the idea that like a Harvard prof would be teaching that. Like just It's like, the Harvard prof who doesn't understand averages.
I mean, that's the kind of education you
fair
get
enough.
at Harvard nowadays.
Yeah, probably. So.
Everybody died at 32. Yes.
That's correct. Yeah.
But also like too, like, another incredible ability of people to not understand how life expectancy works.
Yeah.
Or like how averaging works.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it makes you feel like you're losing it as a historian because you're like, baby, I'm not even good at maths. That's why
I'm not in math. That's why I'm doing this.
But I know how to do an average. Right. I know how to do an average, and I know what that means, right? And this inability to understand that an average doesn't mean everybody just drops dead at 32 is very difficult for me to get my head around. And, you would think that this would be simple, and yet here we are, And, I can complain about Dan Brown all I want. He's still maybe he does get wined and dined.
I mean, he probably does. I mean, he's Dan Brown. I mean, but, in fairness too, I mean, if I wrote, the Da Vinci Code and then had Tom Hanks in a movie that I wrote and then wrote a very successful follow-up and stuff like that, like I would just be living in a chalet somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Not spending any time doing anything like this, I guess. So I guess, he can publish whatever he wants. So
yeah, good for him, I guess,
Good for him. I'm not one to begrudge people's success. He's not doing a lot of harm. And it gives us, like, we get to talk about it. So
yeah,
he has brought something into the world.
Do you know, maybe people are going to read this trash book and get interested in Czech history, actually, and then they'll come find me. And then
there you go.
Happy.
Yeah.
So let's go with that,
That's right. Like, you never know when the new kind of pop culture sensation is going to be there and how it's going to hit, the Middle Ages. Because, like we were talking about kind of earlier, like the Middle Ages are kind of everywhere all the time. And so something kind of breaks through, and then everybody wants to kind of figure something out, not necessarily talk to me or anything like that, but they want to know something more about the Middle Ages kind of generally.
And so I have to come down as pro in that side. I try to think that the world is large and that as a whole, people reading books is good. People seeing movies that have medievalisms in them or medieval history in them is good. I like some medieval movies and think that they are good. I like the idea that we could be talking about these things at any given time. And so, things aren't always perfect, but I guess that we do have to get alongside of those individuals who are kind of like doing things that annoy us slightly sometimes. I know, like, for example, as someone who largely does public history now, there are plenty of academics who on any given day are really annoyed with you, right? Because you have to paint in broader strokes. There is more detailed information that one leaves out for a general audience that you wouldn't leave out for an academic audience. Yeah. And that's because we're trying to convince people to read a fucking book over here. Right?
That's right.
That's right. I'm so sorry, but people don't want to read technical writing in their everyday life. So, I guess I'm somewhere on this spectrum.
Yeah.
Of entertainment to academic history.
The thing that's oftentimes frustrating about that is that I think even any scholar, anybody who studies kind of anything, they actually fundamentally understand that just because you're explaining it in a different way doesn't mean you're being dishonest, or you're kind of, you might be eliminating nuance, but it doesn't mean that the nuance doesn't exist. Like as a teacher, for example, like I talk about the exact same thing differently when I'm talking to an intro undergraduate class than I talk about it differently when I'm talking to a graduate seminar. And I will talk about the exact same thing differently when I'm writing an academic paper. Like we do this all the time. And so just because you're presenting material to try explicitly to get them interested, to bring them in, a very smart person, it was you, told me once that more is more, right?
Yeah.
When you're doing this kind of work, when you're doing public history. And so like it is really a case often, it should be a case really, and it really is actually, even though people don't see it, that, a rising tide lifts all boats here. More people interested in the Middle Ages, they will seek out more information.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they read your blog post, they listen to a podcast, they read a trade book. They want to know more about the Crusades or Czech history or something like that. And then academics can provide that. And they are providing that information, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one of the things that is really cool about doing public history. And what I really love is you can present people with the fun version of it. The I guess headlines is what I often say. It's like you're sort of giving people the headlines. Here is the broad thing that you need to understand. And here's a little bit of nuance below that. And then because people are quite clever, they can go read academic works on that later if they decide, actually, I'm quite piqued by this information. And then they can go look up the hardcore stuff. But it's much easier to sell people on reading hardcore academic history if they've decided they're already interested and they're willing to kind of like sit down and read a tome. Right?
That's right.
And so I think that we have to kind of provide those breadcrumbs. That's our job as public historians, is to say, here's some information. Would you like to know more?
Yeah, and I think that public history, or at least I conceive of public history. I mean, I don't want to speak for you. I think you seem to suggest it in the same way, is that it's a form of pedagogy. It's a form of teaching too, right? And the best form of teaching is not kind of information delivery in which I just kind of yell information at you, but it's more kind of about a process of knowledge creation in which you work together. It's just like, hey, let's explore this topic, together. I'm going to be your guide because I know more about it than you, and you can come along with me and you can learn more too. Please learn more, read more about these things, watch some videos.
Yeah, I would love that,
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Also, I suppose I still engage in academic work. I still do academic writing. I've just helped co-edit a volume, for example. I contribute chapters, things like that. So I'm still kind of doing the really nitty-gritty academic work elsewhere, which then informs the public work. But fundamentally, I think that we have to look at public work a lot more like, an intro class, where we're talking to people who know that they are interested enough that they've shown up here and they need to know where to go next. And, that's what the work is about, really.
Yeah. No, I think absolutely. It's about building community in a really fundamental sense and trying to get people interested. And maybe this will be the only time, that they listen to a podcast or watch a show or read a book or something like that on that particular topic. But at least they're going to know more now than they did before, and they're going to have a better kind of understanding than they would have otherwise. Yeah. I did want to ask, if it's okay, too, is about, because you are doing a lot of different types of kind of public engagement, which we've kind of hinted at. And of course, I'm sure a lot of listeners already kind of know your work generally, blog, podcasts. You wrote, a really wonderful book, The Once and Future Sex, out at all fine bookstores nowadays right now. And then, of course, like kind of TV stuff. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that transition, like the actual kind of logistics of it? Like, because I think people, they don't understand kind of what's the difference between kind of a scholar who sits, at a university classroom or something like that, and then the type of work that you're mostly doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got into, I suppose, the first step in the field was podcasting.
Okay.
And really the podcasting came about during lockdown because, everybody was starved for stuff to do and think about. And I was already friends with people kind of in the podcasting world more generally, not history podcasters, but podcasters writ large. So I had done, some podcasts here and there when people wanted a historian on, that kind of a thing. And so I was doing more and more of that. And then, I've actually have like quite a funny story about so I've got 2 podcasts now. And one of them is more of a DIY podcast that I do with my mate Luke. And Luke and I were friends via, the noble art of shit posting on Twitter. And Luke is just like one of these people who he is incredibly good at making memes. Like he's just makes these really funny memes. And he'd made like a historical meme about, the Bible being translated into vernacular languages, and I had actually him. I was like, I was like, oh well, this is really funny, like really good joke, but actually this thing. And to his credit, Luke was like, oh god, that's really interesting, and we kind of started chatting about it. And then he just was kind of tipsy one night and was like, hey, what do you think about doing a podcast? And I was like, oh yeah, that would be nice. So I started doing that. And then, I was kind of doing more and more of those things and guesting on more other people's podcasts. And eventually, the other podcast I do now, which is kind of like my fancy podcast, Gone Medieval, there were 2 hosts, Matt Luce, my wonderful co-host, and the fabulous archaeologist Kat Jarman was the other. Mm-hmm. And Kat basically just got too busy because she's an archaeologist, right? And so she was constantly attempting to dig holes in the ground, and podcasting was kind of like getting in the way. And so I got brought in to replace Kat. And in the meanwhile there, like that particular podcast is hosted over on the History Network. And they also make television shows. And similarly, because I'd, been doing some guesting on their shows, during lockdown, they sort of said, oh, well, have you ever thought about doing TV? And I was like, well, would love to. Right, that'd be fabulous.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
They were really starting out earlier on, and it was lockdown, and they were like, if you can kind of think of an idea for a cheap show, and I was like, yeah, well, let's just do one about medieval London, right? Because I'll do on a television show what I do when friends come to London, and I go, hey, look at this is interesting. You can think about these things. Mm-hmm. And like in retrospect, it's very funny because it's like, damn, if we could go inside here right now,
man, you would see some things.
Oh, it would be cool as hell. And so, but then that did really well because people like medieval history, right? And so I did that one, and then I did one about like basically the 3 castes in European society, and then there was more of that, and then when you get on people's radar, then you get invited on other television shows, and it is really one of those things where kind of the more you do in the public sphere, the more you come to people's awareness, and so you get offered more opportunities to do those things because people know that you're a name of someone that you can ask. So people tend to come to me. And also, I suppose that like I get asked a lot, like, oh, how did you get into this? Often by bright young things. What I always say is actually, if what you're interested in is doing kind of broadcasting in the history sphere, I had a theater minor in undergrad, and that really helps. So, like getting a communications degree or a theater degree or like doing some training in public speaking is quite helpful, I think. So, yeah, there's that. That's the secret. That, nobody tells you about.
The secret sauce.
Yeah.
Is actually think about performance when you're performing?
Yeah. It turns out it's not just sitting there and rattling off names and dates. It has to actually be a performance that people get interested in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, being entertaining is half of it because it is a form of entertainment. That's what broadcasting is, so.
Yeah, and I think it certainly applies even in kind of more academic context as well, is that one of the problems that people always complain about and nobody seems to really do anything about is that graduate training is often just focused on research, right? It's not focused on teaching. It's not like how do you manage a classroom, but like how do you present the material so that students actually understand kind of what you're talking about? And that's part performance too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I do think that there is a huge overlap there that people kind of forget about. And yeah, I think especially because I did my PhD here in the UK, we're even more kind of like left out to dry in terms of learning to teach. It's a lot more like, well, there you go, you get thrown in at the deep end. Mm-hmm. And I always really liked teaching was kind of my thing. My joke is that I love to teach. I hate to grade is my thing. And what I really want to do is I want to have conversations with people.
Yep.
You know, I want to say, what do you think about that? I love being able to assign homework because I'm like, what'd you think about that? You like that reading? What'd you think? You know, kind of sort of a thing. It's like, I find that really quite fun. And I would say that like the biggest thing that I miss from working in academia more particularly is teaching. You know, I just love students. I just think undergrads are the best of us. I just think that they're a great bunch of people. And so, yeah, it is a form of performance that you can roll that over into broadcasting more broadly, for sure, for sure. You know, you just kind of have to be aware that you're doing a performance, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and I think that I would assume, or maybe this is actually more of a question than it should be an assumption, is that the fact that you were an American living in London and primarily, you know, being on British TV or performing mostly for British audiences, have you run into any issues with that, or like have you gotten any feedback kind of about that, or is that just not a thing?
Well, yeah, there definitely is feedback that I get. So interestingly, I get it more from North Americans.
Really? Okay.
Oftentimes, North Americans are really quite upset when they are presented with a medieval historian who has their accent, which is interesting. And I've had multiple people say it to me. And hilariously, it usually comes as like this, like a very roundabout way to a compliment, where they'll be like, you know, when I first heard you, I really didn't like it. You know, I really didn't like hearing your accent. And I'm like, okay, fantastic. Okay. And they're like, but now I realize that you are. And I'm like, yeah, thanks for that. But certainly there is something to overcome in the British context. And in a way, I think I am like almost anyone over here that doesn't have, you know, what we call an RP accent or a received pronunciation accent, which is sort of like BBC English. Yeah. You know, you would face similar difficulties with getting in front of audiences if you have like a very strong Northern accent. Sure. Like, God help you if you've got a Birmingham accent. You know, people are not particularly kind about it. So it is really something to overcome. And I do think that, you know, if I had a posh English accent, I would be doing better. You know, it would be a little bit easier to kind of get forward in the world. And it is, I would be lying if I said it wasn't something to overcome. It definitely is. But I think that fundamentally, you know, that's where the PhD comes in. Yes. Right? Like you have to know your stuff. It can't just be frivolous. And there are people who are in the public history world who are not trained and, you know, they're able to make entertaining programs and things like that. But I don't think that I would be afforded the opportunities that I have been if I wasn't called Dr. Janega. You know, let's just say that. Yeah. You know, yeah. So no, and I think you know, that's an interesting point too, because I think that, I mean, the public wants expertise. Like, it doesn't know where to find it necessarily, and I think this is kind of generally true. And there's been a lot of talk, and this is also a problem, you know, that in modern politics, that expertise is not particularly valued sometimes, most times nowadays. But in this space of public history, it does seem that expertise does matter, that PhD does matter. They want people who know things about the past. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it really does open doors. And, you know, it is helpful because I'm able to kind of pick things up and put them down. You know, I guess one of the major things that you actually learn in a PhD is just where to look things up, you know, what to go read. How to find information. Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, I spend generally the way that I organize my days is because I'm kind of like an afternoon brained person. I always say if you're going to start, you know, writing for a living, you have to figure out when your brain is really firing on all cylinders. And for me, you know, like writing happens in the afternoon more than any other time. So I spend my mornings reading is what I do. So, you know, I read other people's books. I read, you know, the latest academic papers, that sorts of things, so that I'm always on top of whatever is happening. And I suppose that is one of the things that's really important from a broadcasting sense, because I am constantly interviewing other historians, much as you are now. And so just having to really understand where it is that particular academic ideas are going, what is the newest and best thing that's coming up. And, you know, the great thing about the way that my life is organized now is I do have this time to do the reading. And I think that's the most important thing. If you're really going to have expertise, there's no getting out of the reading one way or another. Yeah, you got to do the reading. You got to do the reading. So if you want to talk about these things. So a lesson for our time more generally, perhaps. Yeah, so absolutely. So
if you had the opportunity, so, and maybe you have something coming up that you want to share, but like if you had the opportunity, if you wanted people to know more about one medieval thing, one thing from the Middle Ages, so movie, TV show, big budget, kind of whatever, what would it be?
Oh, if I could do anything, like a wave a magic wand, I want to be able to do a big budget television show about Czech things. I come by it honestly. That's the thing I'm really interested in.
So would it be Hussite focused?
Yeah, I think so. I keep every year pitching over at History Hit. I'm asking for a twofer. I want to do 2 episodes. I want to do one on Charles IV's Prague, and then I want to do one on the Hussites. So like back to back, like bang, bang.
Yeah.
What about these 2 big things that happen in a row? And like what happens when you become kind of like the center of Europe, and how does that shake out? And so, inshallah, 2026 will be my year and this will happen. Well, I'm not sure whether or not it will. And I feel quite passionately about this. I think, damn it, if Dan Brown can write a book about Prague and he's not even an expert, then how come I can't too?
I was going to say, maybe that moment is coming, right? So if this book takes off, which, most Dan Brown books do, then you might have your moment coming.
Yeah, he might have softened everybody up. In which case, I owe him a drink. But yeah.
Well, Dan, if you're listening, you can get in touch.
That's right. Yeah.
We'll hook you up with some actual medieval history too. Maybe you're not interested, but we'll figure it out. So. And on that note, unfortunately, we are just about out of time here. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for joining us.
Oh, Matt, an absolute delight, and congratulations on the show. I'm so pleased that there is a place for, Americans to think about this more broadly, because I think that we're actually quite good at this medieval history thing.
I think so too. And I think that hopefully our listeners will learn that. We have lots of great guests coming up on the show over the course of the next few weeks, and then, of course, weeks beyond that as well. So thank you again, Eleanor, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this first episode of American Medieval. And stay tuned. Next week, we'll be out with a new episode. And until then, take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiaffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.